Hi, thanks very much for the invite. My name is Alan Johnson. I'm a director at BICOM, which is the Britain-Israel Communications and Research Centre, which is an independent organisation. My background in this issue is coming out of the left. I'm an editorial board member at Dissent magazine, which is an American democratic left magazine. In the early 1980s, I was involved with attempts to stop the banning of Jewish societies, and from there worked with UJS as part of a left group which developed support for the two-state solution, which at the time on the left in Britain in the 80s was very, very unusual. And that's my route to this, and I'm not Jewish. Thanks. Okay, I'll try and make 6 points in 3 minutes. First point, this conflict can't be resolved outside of direct negotiations between the parties. Second point, what the international community has to do and what I think international civil society has to do when it's trying to measure its actions is to think, is what we're doing now likely to get the two parties into negotiations, or is it likely to push them away from negotiations? Which I think when we come to maybe discussions around boycotts and so on, BDS, demonising Israel, isolating Israel, that's the thing to bear in mind. Is this going to get the parties to negotiations? If we don't get them to negotiations, we do not have a solution. However good it feels in your heart, however you can express your identity through those kind of politics, it is not getting the parties to the only place that can make the deal. Thirdly, I think we have to deny the parties alternatives to negotiations as far as possible, dramatic, magnetic attractions outside of the negotiating room, whether that be violence, whether it be unilateralism of various kinds on both sides, traditionally hampered negotiations and kept the parties apart. Fourth, we must build trust and confidence between the parties. In negotiations, the parties don't have to just have confidence in each other, which is important, but they have to be able to carry their populations behind them. Those populations need to feel that they're not being demonised, they're not beleaguered, they're not isolated, and they're willing to support their own leaders, taking big risks for peace and making excruciating compromises for peace. Both sides will have to make excruciating compromises on issues that are central to their identity and to their history and to their narrative for this to be possible. That's only possible in turn if the populations behind do not feel completely beleaguered. Fifth point, what's the deal? I think the deal is the deal that Olmert, the Israeli Prime Minister, put down at Annapolis, which was not accepted by Mahmoud Abbas in 2008. Palestinian state on territory equivalent to the pre-67 West Bank and Gaza Strip with mutually agreed land swaps. City of Jerusalem to be shared. Neither side declaring sovereignty over the city's holy places. The Palestinian refugee problem being addressed within the framework of the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, which is that the new Palestinian state will become the home of the Palestinian refugees, just as the state of Israel will be the homeland of the Jewish people. And because Israel's security is vital to the implementation of any agreement, discussions around the demilitarization of the Palestinian state, with both states cooperating to fight terrorism and violence. I think that's the deal that will eventually be struck. The land swaps here or there will be debated, and it will be very difficult to get there. There's all sorts of issues around Golan Heights, water, etc., etc. But basically, that's the shape of the deal, I think. If it is, what's the route to the deal? On the left, but the route to the deal, I think, is someone once said the Israelis can satisfy the Palestinians' territorial demands when the Palestinians are able to satisfy Israel's existential demands. By that word, I just mean questions of existence, which is twofold. One, security, and two, the question of the refugees. The fear is that what's actually under discussion is not two states for two peoples, and that second clause is all important, for two peoples, but the recognition of one Palestinian Arab state now, and then a second Palestinian Arab state in time, achieved by return of the refugees and achieved by demographic change. That is not going to build the kind of confidence that either the peoples or the parties need to make negotiations a success. And in terms of how the parties are measuring up, if that is how to get to a deal, here's the claim I would make. I would make the claim that the territorial is not fundamentally the problem. I would say that if you look at what Barak offered at Camp David in 2000, what was offered at Tauba in 2001, what was offered by Olmert in 2007 at Annapolis, the territorial is not the problem. If you go back in time and you interview someone from the Likud and Labour in the 70s, and then you come forward in time, what you'll find is this. Nobody is speaking like the Likud now. Nobody. Everybody is speaking like Labour. The basic acceptance has been made within Israeli society of the two-state solution and of the compromises necessary to make it. Is it possible to say the Palestinian side that they have accepted the idea of a Jewish homeland unequivocally, or that the regional Arab states have either? Mentioning Netanyahu in this audience might not win me a lot of friends, but I'm going to say this, which is when he stood at the Congress recently and he said, Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, said, I stood before my people, it wasn't easy for me, and I said, I will accept the Palestinian state. It's time for President Abbas to stand before his people and say, I will accept the Jewish state. Those 6 words will change history, said Netanyahu. Was he wrong? No, he wasn't. Obviously, we can't cover everything that's been raised, and I would like to come back to settlements in a future answer, but now I'd like to say something, first of all, about Hamas, answer to your question, something about one state, something about this word you can't say, it's like Voldemort, who shall not be named. Okay, preface this by saying, in April I was working with and talking with Hatem Kayali, Fatah militant, and with Fatah Central Committee members in Ramallah. So the points I'm going to make about Hamas are about Hamas. Fatah militants, by the way, last time were being thrown off roofs by Hamas militants in Gaza. The point that Jeremy makes, why I disagree with it, is that back channels are not negotiations. They're two completely different things. The British government kept up back channels with the IRA all the way through the conflict. What they didn't do was negotiate directly with the IRA until one thing happened. What was that one thing? Martin McGuinness, who's the leader of the IRA military council, literally rang up and said, the war is over, but we need you to bring us in. From that moment on, we had real negotiations and we had a peace process. Now, is Hamas anywhere near that Martin McGuinness moment yet? No, it isn't at all. Instead, what we've got, you think about the character of Hamas. You're talking about an organisation that is explicitly anti-Semitic. Its charter enshrines anti-Semitism inside the charter. The old image of the cosmic Jew, not this Jewish person or that Jewish person, but the Jew, is enshrined in Hamas's charter as someone who caused the First World War, the Second World War, economic crises, etc., etc. Another, all the classic anti-Semitic tropes that there are. It does not accept Israel's right to exist. It is raining rockets down upon the south at the moment. What's to negotiate? If you look at what Hamas militants themselves say, Hamas leader, the expulsion of the Jews will come from all of Palestine, we are going to expel them. Now, how do you negotiate with that? Well, you know, when are you going to expel the Jews? That's not a negotiating platform available at all. Hamas leaders, my great hope is bringing an end to the entire Zionist project in Palestine. So that's briefly about Hamas. Other quick points. The one-state solution, we might come back to it. One of the points I want to make about it is this. No one supports it amongst significant Palestinian or Israeli negotiators or activists or parties. It is purely a Western intellectual construct. Western academics are very into the idea, as we've heard tonight, but it has no traction at all amongst the two peoples. What the two peoples want is not one state. They want to express their national identity in a state of their own. They want national sovereignty, and they should have the right to pursue that national sovereignty through negotiations. I feel like I've probably spoken enough, but I've got another few seconds about apartheid. Right, it's this question of apartheid. Distinguish between what's going on inside Israel and what's going on in the West Bank. In Israel, it's just stupid, frankly. It's an insult, it's abusive, it's just stupid, as Goldstone said recently. So if you want cold and clear, let's do cold and clear. Inside Israel, full and equal political rights. The Israeli Supreme Court consistently interpreted its basic law as guaranteeing equal rights for all Israeli citizens. The Supreme Court ruled that a political party which stood on the platform of a state for all its citizens, that did not contradict Israel as being a state of the Jewish people. The Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs says Arab Israelis are citizens of Israel with equal rights. Quote, the only legal distinction between Arabs and Jewish citizens is not one of rights, but rather of civic duty. Since Israel's establishment, Arab citizens have been exempted from compulsory service in the Israeli Defense Force. Now remember in South Africa, you're talking about helots, essentially repressed helots in every aspect of their lives because of their skin colour. No citizenship rights, no voting rights. None of this looks like that. Israel has a publicly financed Arab language school system, a state-sponsored system of Muslim courts for marriage and family status. Arabic is an official language of the state. You can attend Israeli universities. There are Arab members of the Knesset, of the Jewish National Fund, of the cabinet. They serve in the courts, police, the army. Even Ariel Sharon declared that every state-run company must have at least one Arab citizen. In the summer of 2008, attempts to remove Arabic as a status alongside Hebrew as official language was defeated, and I could go on and on and on. So it's just simply ridiculous to say that Israeli Arabs inside Israel proper are suffering anything that you could refer to as apartheid. In the West Bank is a conflict so that the roads, so the things that have been mentioned, for instance, roads. Well, just a few weeks ago, Mr. Asher and his 8-month-old son, who are now dead after being attacked by rocks, that's one of the reasons why people have constructed roads and so on, because it's a conflict zone, it's a conflict situation. Why was the separation barrier written? You'll hear again and again decontextualized arguments. So, for instance, we'll hear the issue of the separation barrier, but what you won't hear is that it was built because there was waves of suicide bombers blowing up cafes and pizzerias in Tel Aviv. Now, what would you do if you faced that? If you tonight went out into Birmingham and you thought there was a chance of you being blown up in a pizzeria, how quickly would you be arguing for your government to protect you? That separation barrier has reduced deaths by over 90%, and it did so very quickly. It will come down when there's peace, when there's a deal. That's the point at which it will come down. So there's a lot of decontextualized talk about the West Bank. I'll leave it at that for now. Just a point to build on the discussion maybe as well is I agree absolutely that I think the right frame in which to think about this, I think Dave's mentioned it, I think the last speaker did as well, is two traumatized peoples. That really what we're dealing with is two traumatized peoples struggling to see each other plain, to trust each other, and to bring their populations with them into a deal to share, which is actually a very small piece of land. And that leads me on to the point I want to make, which is in defense of negotiations. I worry sometimes that there's an emerging consensus there, and we heard it at the beginning in the introductory remarks, negotiations are hopeless, we've had 20 years of negotiations, we've got nowhere, etc. Just, hold on, let's just go back 20 years, think where we actually were, and think where we actually are now. If you look at the process of Camp David, you look at enormous concessions being made by Barak, and Arafat not actually coming back with a counter-offer. Not that he disagreed with a particular aspect of what Barak was proposing, but there was literally no counter-offer. You then go through the Clinton parameters, and you go on to the Olmert offer, which I read out at the beginning at Annapolis, and my challenge to you in part would be Olmert plus what? If you don't think Olmert was worth accepting, or even engaging with by Abbas, Olmert plus what? What, other than the things I read out at the beginning, do you think Israel should be offering? And in terms of replying to the guy's question back there about is Israel making any moves at all, Israel has basically given up the hope of Greater Israel. It has given up Judea and Samaria. 60 to 70% of Israelis are absolutely clear that when the deal is there to be struck, they're ready to strike the deal. That strikes me as the product of negotiations. The other product of negotiations is the creation through the Oslo process of Palestinian state building. Salam Fayyad has transformed the West Bank. I was in Ramallah, and it does look like a building site. The joke is, it is a problem about where do you park the 4x4 and so on. Young, savvy activists, with their laptops, engaging in a tremendous program of nation building, new economic institutions, new roads, new hospitals, new kinds of trade arrangements. The World Bank and the IMF saying this is tremendous progress. That as well is also a product of moving away from the Second Intifada, moving away from violence. Cooperation with America and cooperation with Israel has been central to Fayyadism, which is his nation-building project, and that's not to be taken lightly at all. It's the bedrock of a future Palestinian state being created over the last period as a result of negotiations. So don't give up on negotiations. The parties will have to make compromises, but there's every reason to think it's possible that they can achieve them.